This episode is brought to you by Peacock and the new original docuseries, Making Manson. In 1969, Charles Manson and his followers committed 7 brutal murders in Los Angeles that would make him infamous. Now, with access to over 100 hours of phone recordings between an incarcerated Manson and his closest confidant, a new story will unfold with shocking revelations from the man himself. Making Manson is streaming now only on Peacock.
Hi, I'm Cassidy.
And I'm Amanda.
And we're the hosts of Drinking the Kool-Aid, a comedy podcast dedicated to the mysterious.
Tune in every week while we cover 2 chilling tales about everything from cults
to aliens
to the paranormal,
all with a sense of humor.
So grab a drink
and tune in to Drinking the Kool-Aid wherever you get your podcasts.
Want to listen ad-free and get to know Natalie and me a little bit better? Make sure to subscribe on Patreon, Apple Podcasts, or search The Murder Diaries ad-free on Spotify. For $2.99 a month, subscribers get to listen to our special journal entry episodes, which is basically like a window view of one of Natalie and I's phone calls twice a month. And you get to listen to every single episode ad-free. We thank all of our listeners who are already subscribed so much. And if you've been considering it, don't wait any longer. Head over to patreon.com, Apple Podcasts, hit the subscribe button on Apple Podcasts, or search The Murder Diaries ad-free on Spotify.
Welcome to The Murder Diaries. We're here today with Zac Rissmiller, a survivor of the Columbine High School shooting on April 20th, 1999 in Littleton, Colorado. He experienced firsthand the beginning of a troubling trend of mass school shootings in the U.S. Since that tragic day, Zac has channeled his experience into powerful advocacy for mental health and school safety, working tirelessly to prevent future tragedies. Welcome, Zac. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
Do you want to let our listeners know a little bit about yourself before we get into everything?
Yeah, like I said, my name's Zac Rissmiller. I'm 43 years old, which may seem like a little bit weird coming from somebody whose high school was shot up, right? But it has been 25 years since it happened. And unfortunately, we're still dealing with a lot of the same stuff that we were dealing with 25 years ago. Although we were one of the first, we were not the first. And I think that that's important to say that when Columbine happened, it happened to be the most deadly, but we certainly weren't the first. And we certainly were not the last, were we? So, but that's kind of what I advocate for and I talk about with friends and with my community members about how we can try to move forward. I speak a lot on media literacy and I speak a lot on how we can better stabilize our society in order to prevent these things from happening. So I'm excited to be here and I'm excited to answer you guys' question.
As somebody who was an older elementary school student at the time and not having been a survivor, I will never forget. And I know that that is something that many of us would say, whether we were here in California like I was, off in Florida, or if you were there at Columbine that day. You mention it and pretty much everybody knows what you mean. That 1999 mass shooting at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. Now, obviously, as we've mentioned, Columbine is the name of the high school at which this horrific event took place, but it's seemingly the name that's used to refer to the incident as a whole. We call it Columbine. To me, this just proves just how infamous this event has become in American culture. And as you mentioned, it's been 25 and a half years, and we're still, I'm going to say, this country is still reeling with the after effects of that and continued school shootings.
Yeah, you're 100% correct. We've really not done anything to address the issue. My biggest thing is that when I'm talking about advocacy for stopping these things, it really doesn't have to come down to a political fight. Is what you believe would help stop it. We have to move forward with it, whether that's better mental health. We have to do something about mental health. In that sort of instance, for me, it's like, okay, great. Well, advocate for that. Do something, right? Because any step in the right direction is still the right direction.
And I think that idea of being active and promoting whatever you think is the right way to approach this is so important for not only us to know, but for our listeners to know. If you believe in something, go out there and make a difference. Don't wait for someone to do it for you. And I think, as we're having you on, and as we've had other people interview with the Murder Diaries, we've learned that it's crucial for us to prioritize your comfort and the comfort of other survivors who come on the podcast when we discuss these sensitive topics.
Mm-hmm.
So when we were preparing for your interview, it was asked that we don't go into details about your experience during the actual events that day. Given the extensive coverage on Columbine through documentaries, podcasts, books, like Paige said, it's been 25 and a half years. I think this approach of not going into the specific will allow us to focus on a more supportive and constructive conversation about you as a survivor and where you are in your life today.
And in all honesty, you could turn on a documentary, a podcast that has been produced throughout the last 25 and a half years and find out what happened if you don't already know. So we so agree.
Sure. And to be honest, I have absolutely asked for that. And the reason I did is because continuing to bring it up, continuing to talk about it, I have been told by multiple mental health professionals that, it's really going to keep me in a state of, it's just a state where I don't want to be. It helps keep my anxiety up. It helps keep, a bunch of bad things around. And so what I try to do then is talk about what life was like before Columbine and what was like after, because it gives a much better painted situation of what society as a whole is. And it doesn't really do anybody any good to know intimate details of the violent act itself. The violent act is what it is. 13 people did perish that day. And the 2 terrorists that perpetrated that are no longer with us. And they took the coward's way out. And that's about all that we have to talk about for that day.
And honestly, it's not your responsibility as a survivor to teach non-survivors. So we're just grateful that you are using your experience and your platform to make a change in the way that you see is most helpful to not only people in the community, but your own mental health as well.
And I think with true crime being such a prevalent genre that we are actively within, this is such an important conversation about those boundaries and ways to consume and participate healthfully in a way, for example, that can be more healing to survivors. You don't have to miss out on conversations because you're afraid a podcast like the Murder Diaries is going to force you to talk about that. We were more than willing to be like, okay, yeah, let's change this question, that question, and work with you and send you, an outline before of where we were hoping our conversation could go, which I think is hopefully where we can kind of continue to go as a genre so people like yourself can feel safe having the conversations and the part of the conversations that are healing.
And to be fair, you're the first podcast to ever talk to me this way. And I am more than appreciative of you guys' willingness to move some stuff around.
And it makes me a little sad, to be honest, that you've had those past experiences where people were not keeping you, the person, in mind. They were just focusing on the story rather than this is an actual person who experienced something heartbreaking and tragic. And let's keep the human in all of this. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I will say this too, this like in the direct aftermath of Columbine, nobody really thought about us and nobody really thought about what we had just went through. We had cameras shoved directly in our faces. Grieving moments of even that day of like hugging my friend because we could not find another friend of ours was then plastered all over the news. And then several years later, I see it on the show Penn and Teller's BS. There's my picture. Again, using my image and likeness without my permission, which was so common. They just didn't care. This story came before anything else, before any kind of human compassion. And it was really hard to take. And, even in the most recent school shooting, we still are shoving cameras in kids' faces. We are still pursuing the story rather than having compassion for the individuals that it happened to and letting them grieve in peace. I watched it happen again, and it's happened every single time.
And these are literal minor children. It's almost to me as if, because these things are so awful and it's hard to come to terms with that they are real as a community that was not directly there, for example, on campus or somewhere where a mass shooting actually happened. It almost feels like maybe too surreal for some people. And unfortunately, those involved, the survivors, unfortunately get kind of lost in that mix where it's just like they're looking at them as if they're not real. And right, they're pursuing the story, and that's all that it is to them is a story, because it's almost like beyond this human brain comprehension. Because to me, it's almost as if this stuff shouldn't even happen in this world. These horrific weapons that are used shouldn't, to me, even exist. And I don't want to get too political, but that idea, it's just so unreal that those that were there or involved just become part of that, becomes the story. And the human within those survivors gets lost. And that is so not fair.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's what we as survivors have this term, grieving in a fishbowl. It is literally the entire world is looking at you, and they're looking at you to be a leader, I guess. But, they're looking in the wrong areas. They're looking for the wrong things.
Before we get too far down the aftermath, and we will definitely come back to it, we'd love to hear a little bit more about what life in Littleton and life at Columbine High School was like before the events.
Okay, so I kind of get excited about this topic because not a whole lot of people ask me or even care, right? Columbine was cool. Columbine was a fun place. I did play a bunch of sports. I was also into art a lot, music a lot, and I was really heavily involved in our video production lab. A lot of those classes I had with the two terrorists, and I don't use their names. I don't, and we can get into that.
Yeah, don't worry. You don't need to use their names. Now, were you in the same grade as them? Is that an okay question to ask?
Yes, it is, and yes, I was. In that, we did videos, and I played in bands. I had a really very normal childhood in middle class, maybe even upper middle class area. I have an awesome family. I come from a family of there's four of us kids. My two sisters who were in 8th grade when it happened, so in a different school, and then my brother was a sophomore. So my sisters are twins, so they're the same age. And it was a very, very, very fun place to be, despite what the press's narrative has been. There really wasn't a ton of bullying at Columbine. I can say this with the utmost confidence because I hung out with punk kids. I hung out with goth kids. I hung out with just about as many different people as I possibly could. Was there no bullying? No, of course not. Of course there was bullying. It was the 90s, and it was high school.
Mm-hmm.
There was bullying. Was there ever such bullying that it rose to the level of which it would have taken to carry out an act like what happened? No, never saw it once. There are some people that are apologists for the two terrorists that say like, oh, we have video evidence. I was like, yeah, I was in that class. They would go and shoulder check and intentionally walk through groups in the hall to try to start a fight and then cry bully out of the whole thing. So no, those two were not bullied incessantly. Were they bullied? Yeah. So was I. So was everybody. Everybody has somebody that like you don't get along with, you don't like, and then they do stuff to you or you do stuff to them. It's high school, it's junior high, it's kids, frankly, being jerks, but it is what kids are. They're jerks. I'm going through it right now with my kid. She's 11. She just started middle school this year. But last year, she was bullied incessantly. Did her school do anything about it? No. Did my child rise to the level of even thinking about something like this? No. Because we have conversations and we figure out how to deal with things in an appropriate manner. And I'm always for an anti-bullying campaign, but that's not going to stop school shootings ever. It's just not going to stop school shootings. But before Columbine happened, we were just happy children. I mean, we loved life. Me and my friends did as many things as we possibly could together. We were always together. We were always outside. We were always up to something. It was a lot of fun, but it was pretty freaking normal.
It's my understanding that at the time, the Littleton area, which is the South Denver metro area, was
Southwest, yeah,
was booming at that time. It was a time of growth and prosperity. I think there was a really big factory out there that was bringing in lots of jobs, and lots of just companies were moving out there, and just, again, things were growing. Families were thriving. Sounds like it would have been a beautiful time to be growing up in that area.
Yeah, everything was really nice. Lockheed Martin had kind of been in Littleton since the 50s, and it's really kind of the reason why Littleton exists. Glenn L. Martin Corporation started in Maryland. My great-grandfather worked for that corporation in Maryland. My grandfather moved his family from Maryland to Colorado to continue working for, at the time, Martin Marietta. And then as they merged with Lockheed, my father worked there, and then I worked there. So there was a very large family history, specifically at that plant here in Colorado. Yeah, but it was a huge time of economic growth for Littleton. A great time just to be around. Lots of new buildings going up, lots of new stuff. The tech center is a kind of an office building area within South Denver. That was being built. New malls were being built. It was crazy. I mean, we kind of, we'd ride our bikes over to Southwest Plaza Mall, and then we would, walk around the mall. We didn't have any money. We just walk around the mall just to be out and to be seen and to see. We were constantly going. The park behind our house, Clement Park, was just being built. It was a cool time to be around.
I'm thinking of my own childhood in Southern California, just about 5-6 years past that. And it's very similar, walking around the mall and just riding bikes and going home once the street lights come on. I mean, I'm picturing and can so relate to that. And it's making me feel a little nostalgic. And it makes me so sad that an event like this could have changed that. Now, was it an experience of, or I guess, can you speak to a little bit about from that beautiful before to the shift after? Was it like night and day, or was it something that was gradual and you had to process? Can you talk a little bit about how the aftermath was different?
Absolutely. People were upset at the way that our town was being sensationalized. People were upset at the way that kids were being literally forced in front of a camera. People were upset that journalists were jumping out of bushes at kids who were just shot at. But people were upset when this stuff was going on. And so they really worked to find ways to be able to get us together, right? They found buildings, didn't turn out to be the best choice, but honestly, those things, like, you wouldn't know unless you had already gone through it. And at that point, it was like nobody really knew what was going to happen, and how people would use that galvanization as a way to sneak in, if you will, a way to try to get their political and even sometimes religious views out there. It became something to where it was a cut for the whole nation, but instead of letting that cut heal, we for some reason kept pouring salt in it. And that was kind of the thing that kind of like took the shine off the community for me, because it was like, there's all these people that are willing to help. And I truly believe that they were good-natured people wanting to help. There was also some bad actors sprinkled in there, for sure.
When you mentioned these bad actors, what do you mean by that? Because I know that there is a definition out there that maybe some people are familiar with, and it may not be necessarily what you're referencing. I guess let's just jump into it since you mentioned it.
Sure. So those buildings that basically the only buildings that we had that could hold that many people. In Columbine, there was just 2,000 students in Columbine. So there was a lot of us. In order to get us all together in a place, we couldn't obviously use our school, right? Which is the normal gathering place for that many people. We couldn't use other schools in the area because they were in school. So the only place left were churches, right? And those churches were extremely nice. And I'm not going to plaster their names or even defame their names because they were extremely nice to open up their buildings to us. The problem is that when they offered us counseling, I needed it. Like, I really needed it. I needed somebody to talk to. And when I went in there, and it was more of a, well, tell me about your faith and tell me about your faith in Jesus. And I was not raised Christian. We didn't go to church. I didn't really have faith. And I had somebody, actually more than a couple of people, tell me that, well, maybe none of this would have happened if you would have just had faith to begin with. And that's really hard for somebody that is already looking for answers, seeking answers, and then told that, well, you were probably the problem.
Especially if you're a teenager and your brain isn't even done developing. There are things that some of the students may have been suffering with, such as survivor's guilt is a real thing, like all these other really complex things that really needed more of a professional that's actually licensed as like a marriage and family therapist or an LPCC.
Or even at the time, just a grief counselor, right?
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't necessarily affiliated with any one group other than just like, yep, I'm a grief counselor. That would have been probably more ideal. And from my understanding, those existed and those were around for us. Every time I went to go find counseling, though, I ended up in the hands of a faith-based counselor, which was not what I needed at the time. Eventually, after several lawsuits, the Jefferson County schools provided us 2 weeks of licensed therapy, because that's all that was, right? 2 weeks.
And 10, for reference, 10 is usually what is recommended at a minimum for somebody who has suffered trauma, if not even more, depending on what that trauma is. But 10 of outpatient is usually like what is the minimum that's recommended. So 2 is not a lot.
Yeah.
How long after the incident was this lawsuit and then the subsequent 2 weeks given to the students? Like, how long did you have to wait? Was it a year later? Was it 6 months later?
Yeah, it was about a year later. I know that I was in college and struggling to go to class at that point. I think it can probably be pretty understandable that when I went to college right after that had happened, I had a pretty hard time going to class. A pretty hard time just even staying on campus, right?
We've touched on the immediate after effects of where you were, where you had to end up being evacuated to. We've talked about, or at least touched on, your experience going to college a year later. But what was it like for your family dynamic? Because like you mentioned earlier, you and your brother were both at the school, and your 2 little sisters a year later would be going to that school, or at least to high school. Because I know you eventually switched, but what was that
Right.
like in the home for you as a survivor, as a family that encountered probably the most evil act that can be done?
I think let's start at the beginning there. So in the immediate aftermath of Columbine, after all of this, like church gatherings and vigils and having just the onslaught of press all the time, it was literally 2 weeks later, and we were back in school at Chatfield High School, because obviously our school was kind of blown up. People were allowed to go. It wasn't even until like the summer people were allowed to go get their backpacks and stuff like that out of the school. It was still obviously an active crime scene. So we went to Chatfield and we did that for, I think it was like a month. I don't know. I don't remember going too often. But then on the last day of school, the coolest thing for me was always like, it was like a sense of normalcy since we didn't get to have that last, senior, like throwing paper in the air, like rejoice of like, this is our last day of high school, right? Our last day of school forever, right? We got to have that one last moment. I just, I always wished that it was at our school, but I was always so grateful for the student staff and everybody involved in making that switch, because the Chatfield students would go in the morning and they were kind of forced to fit learning into a much more condensed period. Same with us. It was only open 8 hours, but it was 4 hours for Chatfield and 4 hours for Columbine. And that was a big, that was huge. Chatfield would be our principal rival in all sports and even academics and debate and everything like that. Chatfield was our principal rival, mostly because it was like 2 miles away from us. It was always a cool, like, little rivalry. And then to have them show up for us like they did was the most awesome gesture that anybody could have done. They really wanted to get us back into routine as quickly as possible, because that was the prevailing science at the time, is like, well, if something bad happens to a kid, you really just want to get them back on track and focused on what you want them to do. Otherwise, they'll keep thinking about and doing these things. We had grief counselors and stuff like that were in the school, and they weren't faith-based. But the thing that I would say about them was they were so busy all the time that it was almost impossible to talk to somebody in that. So after that, and after a year, I remember, and I'm not 100% sure on this, so we may need to fact check this, that there was a lawsuit that eventually came, that they eventually agreed to give us 2 weeks worth of counseling. And I did that. And during that 2 weeks, I was asked by my counselor in that office if I would maybe want to go to Los Angeles to meet Mary Kate and Ashley Olsen. And I did. And I was in the Mary Kate and Ashley Olsen magazine, where they did a interview with us. And there was 4 of us from Columbine, and there was 4 from some other schools that had also gone through this. I actually have the magazine downstairs. It's a strange one, but I always thought it was kind of funny of like getting spring fashion tips next to a article about school shootings, in which they really, really worked hard to try to figure out an answer to all of that. I'm not sure that really came about, or that really worked super well, but.
This episode was sponsored in part by Masterclass. For a gift that's always on time and lasts a lifetime, you can't do better than Masterclass. Masterclass is the only streaming platform where you can learn and grow with over 200 plus of the world's best. That's why Wirecutter calls it an invaluable gift. With Masterclass, you're gifting unlimited learning. Learn from any Masterclass instructor anywhere, on a smartphone, computer, smart TV, or even in audio mode. Plus, you can help your loved ones use behavioral science to read people, from FBI criminal profiler John Douglas, uncover the truth with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Bob Woodward, or successfully negotiate any situation with FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss. All the classes really make a difference. In fact, 88% of members feel that Masterclass made a positive impact on their lives. There are so many incredible, influential instructors on Masterclass. I've taken so many sessions, and I would say probably my favorite class was Kris Jenner's. And I know there's a few of you out there who would love to take it too. Another great thing about Masterclass is there's no risk. Every new membership comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So give your loved ones a year of learning with Masterclass. Masterclass always has great offers during the holidays, sometimes up to as much as 50% off. Head over to masterclass.com/murderdiaries for the current offer. That's up to 50% off at masterclass.com/murderdiaries. Masterclass.com/murderdiaries. First of all, you're talking to 2 millennial women. So even in the conversation, as serious as it is, I couldn't help but be a little excited for you to have met Mary Kate and Ashley, because they were, I can speak for both Paige and I in this, that they were our childhood.
We grew up on them entirely, from their videos on down to their TV shows. I'm surprised I didn't read that issue of the magazine. I begged my parents for that magazine, but it was a little bit different to get than just like at a grocery store. So sorry, Natalie, I didn't mean to cut you off, but we're both very like, oh my gosh.
I was not expecting their names to come up in this conversation, so I'm a little thrown off, but I do want to give them credit, or at least their team credit for, you know, they were probably a little bit younger than you and they had a large platform, especially in a day where there wasn't social media, to shine a light on survivors in the best way that they knew how at that time. Obviously, things would be done so differently nowadays, but it is an interesting and unique experience. What did you feel about it when you were flying to LA, when you were being interviewed for this magazine? Did you resent the attention at all? Were you grateful for it? How can you put me in your mind, if it's okay to go there?
Yeah, it is. It's totally fine. So I haven't thought about it in years. I think the quote that they had in the magazine is that I, during the interview, was standoffish and brooding. And I think that it was mysterious for some reason. The idea there is that I guess I went in with the understanding that this was going to be a interview that was going to try to move the needle forward, right? You know, I was 19, maybe 20 at the time. It felt disingenuous. It felt like we were supposed to show up and like everything was like, oh yeah, that happened, but everything's better now, you know? And it's not what it was. And I think that some of my answers kind of like tripped them up about like, well, what can we do to prevent this in the future? And I think I started saying things like, well, we're going to need to close the gun show loophole, and we're going to need to do X, Y, and Z. And they were serious answers when I think that they were looking for, well, we just need to respect each other, you know? And so generally, that's the kind of the thing I got when we were doing it, you know, and it seems so silly now for me to have thought that way. You know, this is a Mary Kate and Ashley Olsen magazine. What do you think that they were going to want? But on the flip side of it, you know, I wasn't prepared to just be like kumbaya with the whole thing. You know, I was ready to have a serious conversation and start to make some serious steps, you know, and it felt like being big leagued the whole time. Like, well, yeah, that's an answer, but it's not really what we were looking for. And they're like, you know, trying to Mary Kate are asking the questions, and then, you know, there's like producers and stuff like around, and they would say something and then they'd rephrase the question, try to get what they were looking for as an answer, right? And so, yeah, it was pretty
superficial. Would that be the right word?
Yeah, it was an experience. That's for sure. We spent more time taking pictures than we did in the actual interview. I remember that. And if you remember from their TV show, they had like a living room set that they had. We sat on those couches. We were on the set of their TV show because they were filming their TV show at that time. So it was at Universal Studios in LA. At that point, I had never seen an ocean. And so I really wanted to go see the Pacific Ocean when we were done, but no one would take me over there. So I came into California and I left without ever seeing the Pacific Ocean. That isn't exactly what I wanted out of that experience, but it was an experience that I had. It was definitely one of the more interesting and weird experiences of my life, but it definitely happened because I'd gone to the therapy that they had provided us. I wish I would have taken that therapy a lot more to heart. My reason for going there is my parents were making me go because I was dropping out of college because I can't, you know, be in class. But that time I really wasn't ready to be talking about it, being as open as I am now with it. It took me a very long time, and probably after, well, I know that on our 10-year anniversary on April 20th, I had a massive mental health break. And it was really hard to do, really hard. But I eventually got into therapy. And I even still do it. I'm always seem to be touching up a little bit.
The irony is not lost on me in that you were literally, and this is just taking it back a tick, you're literally sitting on couches that are on a set that not only is it currently in LA, that set for so little time was supposed to be in, I'm pretty sure it was Malibu or Manhattan Beach that show was set in. Yeah, it was Malibu. So the irony is not lost on me. And I think that just kind of goes to show again how you get lost in the shuffle. They wanted your story, they wanted your face. And I don't think that they knew better. So obviously the maliciousness, I don't feel like was there, but
I don't feel like it was malicious. No.
Yeah, it was just the ignorance of it all. And I think with Columbine being one of the first, and definitely the first that was a name in home that everybody knew and knows about still today, I think that is also why it was just so, people they should have known, but barely knew what the heck to do when working with you guys and how to keep you guys safe. It's heartbreaking.
I would say that they didn't know, because if they did, I choose to believe that they would have acted different.
True.
And that goes across all media. Mm-hmm. Because I think that if they would have known, they would have acted better. And it is now my advocacy out there to really go and speak to the members of our community, the members of the media and the press, just to make sure that they know, hey, no notoriety is a thing. It is something that we need to continue to talk about and continue to be advocates for, because the last thing that we need is more of these kids who idolize these shooters, so-called Columbiners, who only look then to, one, get revenge for bullying. They were the bullies. They weren't getting revenge for bullies. And two, to get their name to be famous. That's exactly what happened when Columbine happened. The shooters' names became way more famous and even infamous, but I'd say both, than the victims of that. And that's wrong. And because this last terrorist was caught alive, his name has been everywhere. And it's wrong. It's flat wrong. I've literally heard the 4 victims' names twice. I have heard his name over and over and over and over again.
And his mugshot and his face. And it's everywhere. I am completely connecting with this right now because it's so true. I think if you ask anybody, whether it is the most recent shooting or Columbine, you can name the terrorists faster than you can name a single victim. And that's on the media that's reporting.
That is a massive problem, yes.
What's that experience for you as a survivor to see this example you just brought up of the school shooting that just happened, to see the same thing being done that was done 25 and a half years ago? Because I feel like, yes, there has been some changes and some things have been learned, because I'm even thinking about your experience on the Mary-Kate and Ashley magazine. Nowadays, we would have a victim advocate present to make sure that your feelings are validated. It's not a trivializing experience. So that's changed. But I think people at least know that should be done. Maybe not every production will do it, but I think people should know better now.
So as a victim and as somebody that does quite a bit of media, I can tell you that it is very rare for somebody to get sent some questions ahead of time and be able to talk about and say why they don't want to be asked certain questions or anything like that. I certainly, when I had said that, I didn't want to jeopardize our conversation. And one of the things that I've had in the past is when I say, okay, well, I don't talk about that day, I get a lot of it's just our listeners or our readers or our viewers would really like to know what happened during that time, because it's not something that somebody can explain unless they've been there. And the only thing that I can say for that is that at that point, I'm not the person that you want to interview, and I'm not the person that is going to go through there. I have never had on set, minus one that I provided myself, a victim advocate. That is not something that's commonplace, and it's not something that, frankly, a lot of places are willing to put up the money for. If I'm getting into something that's very heavy, I bring my personal psychologist with me to make sure that I'm in the right mindset before I go in, and then we break down and refile stuff as it's happening to me after it, right? So that I'm not putting my mental health on the line for somebody else. It would be shocking to show up to an interview in which a victim advocate was provided and it wasn't self-provided. And I think that goes for a lot of survivors as well. I think that we want to think that us in the media, and I include myself, I mean, I have an audience of 50,000+ followers. When specifically we talk about these things, we are and can be very easily victimized into sharing things that we don't necessarily want to share by repeated questions, right? And it's something that we have to be advocates for ourselves. For instance, with this podcast that I'm currently speaking on, you guys reached out, you were respectful. As always, I don't respond until I have gotten a decent idea of who you are and what you do. I noticed that in several places you had said that we always ask the interviewee questions before coming on, and they get to choose whether they want to answer those questions or not. And full stop there. I obviously don't have editorial access here, but it is very nice. And it's frankly the only media I'll do anymore because I don't want to get hit with an ambush that I have to look like a child and get up and leave, because it will be framed as such.
I think it's definitely something we like to use the word trauma informed. First of all, we appreciate that recognition. And again, we refer to it as trauma informed. We did not survive the things that we speak to survivors about, but it's the least that we can do when we consider the experience of survivors. Specifically in this case, a survivor of a mass shooting. Do you think that there are other things such as sending the questions earlier and other trauma-informed ideas? Do you think that there are others that could be addressed in these situations when it comes to media or really anybody who is working with survivors?
Honestly, the big thing is to finding out what the boundaries are ahead of time. The last thing that you want is to ask a question in which you're going to trigger a fight or flight response from that survivor, right? You don't want to put the survivor back into the thing that is the reason why you're interviewing them, right? But you don't want to put back there, meaning in a flashback or something of the sort. What you do want to do is figure out where their boundaries are, and then make sure not to cross them. And giving an advanced copy of the questions, even if you're unwilling to change them, is a big thing, so that if the survivor is not comfortable with answering those questions, if you're not willing to change those questions or give at least some kind of leeway here, then obviously, it sensationalizes, because I've seen it before, having to end an interview. And then it always gets framed as that person's crazy, that person is a child, that person can't handle a simple question, right? But it is that sort of journalism that is unacceptable. It's just flatly unacceptable. We can document the lives of survivors. We can document what survivors are comfortable with, and we can continue to go down the ride of understanding and advocating for survivors without re-traumatizing them. And that is my big mission in life.
I think in my mind, I was assuming people and productions were really learning from being trauma informed and getting these advocates on set. Because I just keep thinking of not too long ago, Justin Baldoni. He directed and starred in It Ends With Us. It's about domestic violence. But he has also done several other productions where he's the director. For example, there was one on cystic fibrosis. It's called 5 Feet Apart. And people were speaking out when he was getting bad publicity for It Ends With Us, the movie he starred in with Blake Lively. It made an impact on them that they were able to have someone there with him. But maybe that's just an example of how rare it is that it made such an impact because they felt that they were protected. And this is someone who went above and beyond what is typical. So thank you for letting me know that maybe this isn't something that happens a lot, but definitely should be happening all the time.
Yeah, no, I've always been my own advocate, right? And I've always said on my TikTok channel that if I'm not comfortable anymore, I'm not going to give you a warning. I'm just going to stop, and this last year I did that. I did it for about 3 months. I just stopped making content because I wasn't in a good spot. And to continue to talk about this sort of stuff, it weighs heavy, and it's not exactly like lighthearted content outside of me trolling trolls, but it is something that I don't take lightly. It is something that I must continue to advocate for myself, and I do. But as far as advocacy in the media, it's rare. It's super rare.
Hearing about being an advocate for yourself and having a hard stop on something like content creation when it is no longer good for your mental health as a survivor sounds like great advice across the board for many, if not all, survivors, especially those of similar experiences. Do you have other advice for those, especially those at maybe the most recent high school where the shooting happened a few weeks ago? What advice would you give them?
The first advice that I give everybody, if they've been the victim of something as horrific as what just happened and what I've been through, is get into therapy and do it quickly. And for God's sakes, take it seriously. The last thing you want to do is wake up 10 years from now, realize that you're having a problem, and now realize that you've got a panic attack disorder or an anxiety disorder or just the immense amount of things that can come from having unchecked and untreated post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm not talking about the PTSD in which I'm having PTSD from that time I got a bad Starbucks. No, this is like an actual medically diagnosed disease or disorder rather, that is something that is ongoing. It does change the chemistry in your brain. It does make you say and do things that you wouldn't normally do due to high levels of stress and high levels of anxiety. I was that person who thought that in the sense of toxic masculinity, I basically said, no, I'm a man. I can deal with this. As these feelings come up, I just have to shove them back down until I couldn't anymore. And then it all came out in a real big day in which I had my first panic attack, ended up in the hospital because I was certain I was dying. It was a real big awakening that I needed to get help. My lack of getting help absolutely destroyed my first marriage. Absolutely destroyed it. I was a habitual spender. I drove my credit and hers into the ground. I didn't understand that these behaviors were also tied to unchecked and untreated mental distress. I just thought that some of the things that I was feeling were just normal for, somebody of 28, 29, right? I'm about to turn 30. I'm having what would be like a quarter life crisis. This is just normal. Clearly, this is not normal. When something like this happens, right, you need to get into therapy immediately. You need to make sure that you're gathering the tools that you're going to need later on in life and even next week. These tools that you learn in therapy are probably some of the greatest things, the greatest tools that you will ever get. And then when you're good on the other side, and make sure that your oxygen mask is on first. When you're good on the other side, now it's time to start advocating and start helping. And that's what I've done. It just took me a long time to get here because my mental state was not good after the fact.
Once that oxygen mask is securely in place, if you will, and you're helping others get theirs on, how do you keep yours in place like that?
I like to think of it as more like I said oxygen mask, but we can even use the metaphor of life jacket, right? Life is going to hit you with waves, no matter what, right? And keeping your head above water it's a hard thing. And even with a life jacket, you're going to get pushed down and you're going to get pulled down. And what trauma is chains that keep your head below the water so that you can't ever come up for air. I would say that like buying tools to be able to cut those chains so you can continue to bob with the waves and keep going, right? Because that oxygen mask and that life vest is only going to do you so good as long as you keep those chains away from your feet.
So it's an active everyday process to keep those chains away from your feet and to keep your head above water.
Every day, yes. And unfairly or fairly put onto my shoulders, right? But it's a struggle that, us survivors have to go through literally every single day. We have to make sure that we don't have the chains around our feet. And if we do have the chains around our feet, probably not a good day to make a TikTok about it, right? It's probably not a good day to make a public address. It's probably not a good day to go on a podcast, right? It's a day to maybe even call out of work. It's a day to maybe even just take a personal day to yourself to like go do something that's fun. For me, that's playing music, and that's going and playing disc golf sometimes. Those are my relaxing things. It's getting out and moving a little bit just to kind of shake off some of those chains, right? But it's about self-care, and it's about taking care of yourself, and it's about keeping those chains away from your feet so that you don't end up with your head below the waves.
It sounds to me like a lot of the active work that's being done is to keep the nervous system regulated.
It's to keep me in my frontal cortex, if you will.
That makes a lot of sense.
Because the last thing I need to be doing is thinking with my cave person brain, my Abdullah Oblongata, right? That may be I'm not a neuroscientist, I don't know. But it's like without me being in my caveman brain, the thing that keeps me alive, right? The thing that keeps me breathing isn't necessarily something that I need every day. I need to have my Homo sapien brain on and working so that I can think rationally through things and not panic.
We've touched on some of these, but what changes would you like to see made since that horrific day in 1999? And or what changes have you already seen that you appreciate in comparative to 1999?
Colorado closed its gun show loophole pretty soon after Columbine happened. I'd like to see that happen federally so that it makes it harder, at least it's somewhat harder, in order to get a weapon.
For those like myself who may not understand completely what the gun show loophole is, do you mind just touching on that a little bit so we're all on the same page?
So the gun show loophole was that they were not required to ask for ID or have background checks when somebody was buying, even though that a lot of times they're buying from a licensed dealer. So anybody can go and grab a gun. So people with domestic abuse charges, people with extensive criminal backgrounds, and underage people could go get guns from those gun shows.
Same day, right? If I'm not mistaken. Same day.
Yes, correct. Same day. The idea is that these changes have to come, unfortunately, federally. I'd love to see them be state by state and be piecemealed. But the unfortunate thing is that it doesn't take a lot to drive an hour as Americans, right? So if somebody's listening to this in Europe and that sort of thing, they're like, driving an hour? Why would we ever do that? No, like I drive an hour to work. Like, it's not a big deal. But driving 3 hours for me to go to Wyoming, where if I'm not mistaken, the gun show loophole is still absolutely open. If I needed a weapon or I wanted a weapon and couldn't get one, 3 hours is not the end all be all of like, oh, that's going to prevent me from doing that. That's actually really not true. And whereas Illinois has some of the toughest, and New York have some of the toughest gun laws in the entire country, yes, they have stuff because places like Texas, Florida, pretty much the entire South, it is so easy to get a gun and then just drive it back. Indiana has some of the most lax gun laws in the state, and it's an hour and a half, maybe not even, from Chicago to Indiana. That by itself is why we need to have this be federal. Everything has to be federal. So closing the gun show loophole, universal background checks, meaning that even if I was to sell you a gun, right, I've got to go, even not as a non-licensed dealer, I still have to go pull your background to make sure that you're okay to provide this weapon to. So universal background check. In Colorado, we have what's called red flag laws. Red flag laws state that if you have been deemed unable to have guns, whether that is a mental capacity issue, mental disturbance issue, or you've committed crimes, the police have the authority to confiscate your weapons, and then due process then happen later. Most people who advocate against red flag laws have an issue with this, and the only reason why they do is they don't understand how red flag laws are put into action. They're usually put into action and can only be put into action by close family members, immediate family members, not even extended family members, right? It has to come from immediate family members. Like, it can't even come from a neighbor, right? It has to come from immediate family. The cops then make initial contact, and they get to make a second decision on that. And then the due process literally comes the day after in a court hearing to make sure that these weapons were not taken illegally from somebody, right? What we're trying to do is make sure that people with a mental disturbance or who have made threats have their firearms taken away, at least temporarily, so that we can get out of the danger area with them, right? I would hope that we would all agree that people who are mentally disturbed should not own firearms. We would think that. I know that there are people that disagree with me on these things, and I would say that, again, they should advocate for whatever they feel like would stop these mass shootings, because at the end of the day, and I think that's one thing that we all want and need to start happening, is these mass shootings go away, or at least become so irregular, and we're able to stop them sooner. Like, that's where my advocacy focuses on, and that's where I'm trying to focus my efforts on. And like I said, if people don't agree with me, they should advocate for the thing that they want to see. But at least we can all agree that it needs to stop. I think there's not a single person on this planet that is going to advocate for it continuing to happen, right? Nobody's that monstrous. Maybe they are, but who knows?
It scares me to think that there could come a point where we just consider it as part of American life and a risk you take every time you step onto a school campus. As an educator, it scares the crap out of me that we could get to that point of just, protect yourself because this is part of American life. It happens.
It's nonsensical and non-logical.
Even earlier, when Paige and I were working on the questions, because we both work at colleges outside of the podcast, we were just mentioning to each other what we would do. We know where our offices or our classrooms are located compared to where our cars are parked or where the closest door to leave. It's something that is a really scary reality that everyone has to consider the moment you step foot on a school campus, like Paige mentioned.
And I will be real with you. I do and have been diagnosed with OCD. I'm very open about it. Those active shooter trainings scare the crap out of me, and I am not that mentally safe during them. Like, I have not done well during those. I guess we could call it a drill.
I definitely understand. My daughter has kind of grown up around me and my hangups, obviously. And so when it comes to active shooter drills, the one thing that I remind her of constantly is that although you may be uncomfortable right now, and that mentally safe is definitely a thing, right? You want to keep yourself mentally safe. Understanding what to do and how to do it and being able to execute it in a timely fashion so that, and I hesitate to say this, but like when the stampede happens, you don't have to think about where you're going or what you're doing,
Mm-hmm.
because there is going to be a position to whether you fight, freeze, or flee, right?
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, my reaction and a lot of other people's reaction was freeze. And that becomes really super hard because that is just, you're in a life or death situation and your brain just does something. And it takes, I mean, when I tell you it takes over, it takes over. There is nothing that you can do to get out of that situation. You may fancy yourself a fighter. You don't know what you're going to do in that situation unless you've trained for it and trained for it and trained for it and trained for it. I'm not advocating for people having to do a ton of active shooter drills. The only thing that I would say is when you're doing them, pay attention and just make sure that you understand what to do and how to do it as a list of instruction, right? So and forgive me here, I'm not trying to be like, oh, as an OCD person, you should be super familiar with lists. The thing that I would say is that there are steps, right? And those steps become in a certain order, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those drills are meant to try to take you out of those order of operations and to try to mess you up. And the only thing that I can say is, continue to trust your brain, right? You're not ever going to feel comfortable in those trainings. That is something that is a fact of life. And I can tell you that there has never been a person in the history of the world that was like, oh God, we get to do active shooter training today. Like that's not going to happen.
It's so true. And something my mom always taught me is that there's something in life that exists that she always puts it as short-term sacrifice for longer-term payout. If I am ever in an active shooter situation, because I was uncomfortable in those 30-minute or so active shooter drills, I'm going to know what to do. And like you said, nobody likes them. So that's normal and that's okay. But in doing them, which I am safe during them, it is better to be uncomfortable and regulate yourself during those moments and learn what the heck to do, which I was surprised in the last few years comparative to the years before to be learning more about if you can flee and you have safely assessed that you can, that can keep you safer, that these are things we are learning. I'm not saying to everybody flee. I am saying after you have assessed, do I need to barricade and hide? Do I need to fight or do I need to flee? Once you have successfully assessed that and you can flee, that fleeing might keep you safer.
Sure.
So I have my different plans planned out of if I need to barricade and if I need to flee, how I'm going to do that, which doors, what I'm going to do first. But you
Sure.
never know until it's actually in action if you could even truly perform those. But I guess that's maybe the OCD talking and doubting that like I need to be, over prepared and always thinking that I could be wrong and all of that.
Sure.
You mentioned your daughter, going through these active drill experiences and practices. All parents are afraid for their children to send them off to school. All parents don't want their children to have to do these drills, but they understand the necessity of it. But I'm curious about your perspective of what that's like for you as a survivor from a shooting that happened in 1999 to 25 and a half years later in 2024, seeing your daughter go through these drills. What do you think about how do you feel about them in terms of like seeing your kid go through them?
I hate the fact that she has to, right? I understand that I'm not saying that school shootings are a fact of life, but preparing for them are right now. It makes me sad that we haven't done enough to fix this issue. What it actually pisses me off. It's hard to even think about. It's the understanding that someday my daughter and I might be in the same club, and that would break my heart. But on the other hand, I always think about if that were to happen, that she would have the best family for that. She would have all the advocates that she would need in the world. And, I'm grateful that there are at least plans, right? I'd be furious if there wasn't any plan. I'd be furious if there wasn't, some kind of resource at school to be able to help get kids to safety, regardless. The police learned so much from Columbine, but like just going in, right? We didn't get that luxury. That was something that they just did not go into the school, and they were preparing for a hostage situation, and they didn't take hostages. So knowing that it wouldn't have to be, I don't know how to say this. It all around, like I can sit here and try to rationalize the fact that like it's a good thing that my daughter has to do these drills and that sort of thing, but that isn't how I feel at all. The good thing that she has the ability to learn to keep herself safe. It sucks that she ever has to even think about something like this. It sucks that I'm having to explain why she has to take that stuff so seriously. It sucks.
I feel the passion that you have just hearing you speak. I can hear the anger, the fear. All of it is so understandable because it does suck. All of it does. But I also I want to ask, now that you have your mindset on as the father of a child going through these drills, and you've given advice as a survivor of a school shooting, do you have advice for our listeners who do have children in schools that may experience what you experienced back in 1999? That maybe something that they could learn from you that they maybe not necessarily would be able to learn from not having gone through it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I don't have anything, because it would be so disingenuous of me to sit here and be like, well, I'm a parent now, and this is how you would deal with. I don't even know how I would deal with it, because frankly, I don't remember the direct aftermath of it. Like I remember like the day, and then for the next, like, I don't know, 24, 48 hours, no memory. Zero. The only thing I can remember is not feeling anything, right? So I can't tell you how to be a good parent in that situation. I couldn't begin to tell you. I can tell you the thing that my parents did, which worked for me. They let me choose my path. They let me hang out with my friends who were the only people that understood what I was going through in the moment. They understood that holding me home would have just made things worse. They understood that love was eventually the way that I was going to find my way out of it. And it was. And I still have a great and an awesome relationship with my parents to this day. But I guess that's my really only advice, is like, listen to them. But force the issue when it comes to therapy. And as the survivor, I would advise you to take it as seriously as you possibly can. So that, again, 10 years down the road, you think you're fine, and you wake up, panic attack disorder,
I think that we could probably talk about this for hours and hours, days, and hope for these changes and come up with different things that, people could do, or changes we want to see. So thank you so much for joining this conversation with us. And hopefully we can continue conversations like this and eventually impactful change will happen.
Yes, we appreciate you being vulnerable with us and our listeners. We appreciate everything you had to share. I know that your message is going to hit home for a lot of these people listening, but even the parents or others who may have experienced something similar. So I can't thank you enough for talking to us today.
Thank you guys for having me on. It honestly is a pleasure to be able to talk with people who can show such respect. I have an enormous amount of respect for you guys and what you're doing. And I wish you the best of luck going forward.
It's literally our honor to have you. And we would love for our listeners to know where they can hear more from you, including your TikTok handle.
Sure. Yeah. I'm at Brewer Zac, BrewerZac on TikTok and Instagram.
Awesome. Make sure you go and follow Zac, everybody. And thank you again, Zac. And we will hopefully be staying in touch through social media, and we'll be watching you on TikTok for sure.
Cheers, guys.
Make sure to follow us on all of our socials at the Murder Diaries Pod and subscribe today to listen ad-free and check out our journal entry episodes. Until then,
Stay safe.
bye.